Mhm. Use the back.
Cheers in here.
Yeah, we go. Oh, Freya doesn't want this one.
Like Harvey's claim that it's not a behavior, it's pretty clear that when we talk about the Catholics, Harvey doesn't want to go to the adultery. Yeah, I think for the reason. What you're looking at is what you have several issues underlying the forensic, which we have to do as the problem three. One's hoping that there is a lecture series, course, if you will, by Andy Higginbottom in the CSSGJ, that one hopes that that will happen in the fall. And so we'll be able to look at his treatment of we'll finish the treatment of the 3 volumes of Marx's Capital. And because the structure that Higginbottom has sort of introduced is useful on the one hand for looking at the 3 volumes of Capital, but also as I think a way in which we can talk about problems of surplus value, as well as other kinds of issues that are not only Hegelian, as you'll see today, but that are ones which sort of require us, much like David Harvey, require us to sort of re-engage, I think, the Grundrisse for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think there's a good reason that David Harvey continued on with certain ideas about the Grundrisse, which he sort of talked about in his course, and so that's where we're headed at the current moment. Let's test for sound. Testing. Okie dokie. Here we go. R. Fineschi on the Grundrisse. Now, I'm using this as a diagram from someplace else, but to introduce this idea that we see now repeated, not only because Chris Arthur looked at it this way, but certainly others have looked at the Hegelian uh, logic involved in the Grundrisse. So we see here the syllogism of value, that is universality, that is money as a universal form, the particularity as the amount of money, and the reference as we get to singularity. Note the UP and individuality, or the single commodity, singularity, the amount, singular amount of money. See, it sort of drills down, right? Universal to particular, maybe, categorical, and then the thing itself. And so the judgment of price, the value of this commodity before us, whatever, is £3. This relation between value and price is important. It is the key to a whole bunch of other problems that we don't need to go into here, but will be suggested as we look at the Article 4 levels of abstraction of Marx's concept of capital. Or can we consider the Grundrisse the most advanced version of Marx's theory of capital? Well, that's sort of hyperbolic, I suppose. I think what's important is to look at the subtlety of it. And the point of Roberto Fineschi's article is to think about what Marx thought about in terms of thinking about capital, that there was a relation between generality or universality as it hones down to particularity and then to the singular. You can see here that there were several plans, and the point of his article is to discuss the different plans, and there were a bunch of them. And of course, the completion of it is always the other problem of, and in this particular case, of course, in terms of the Grundrisse, so we don't have, it has a certain authenticity because it's not meddled with at some level by Engels. So it doesn't, in fact, have that kind of intervention that the posthumous intervention of Engels, which, for better or worse, is a thing. Let's put it that way. So let's look at the first column. What is produced is consumed ex machina, capital as a whole, undivided. And in the column particularity, going along the row, what is produced is consumed ex machina, particularity is competition. Capital as a whole, undivided, as generality, it represents as particularity, once you sort of drill down, one, many capitals, accumulation. As we move further down in the final, where it says final plan, what is produced is consumed ex machina, and across is competition. The final plan has capital as a whole divided into one/many capitals accumulation. So, and in the column, one many capitals in competition. So you can see, without a lot of energy, that accumulation moves into the generality, which is sort of the point. Ultimately, that's kind of the overall business, that the problems of primitive and capital accumulation are ultimately where he's headed to in terms of a generality or universality. And one and many capitals in competition achieves the moment, as it were, that the same kind of thing that Sheikh is looking at. So, I like to think all these things sort of fit together. You sort of have to, it's a troublesome map. So anyway, the Fineschi article begins with, more Marx. Marx began his economic studies in Paris in 1844. However, only in the late 1850s did he write a first organic draft of his theory of capital. The manuscripts of 1857-8, 1857 to 1858, generally known as the Grundrisse. which is foundation in German. The philological research has shown that before this time, he was still linked to Ricardo's ideas, or only dealt with issues of the quote-unquote surface. He did not write an organic outline of his political economy. The research continued in the manuscripts of 1857 to 1858, but in this text, the exposition began as well. In these manuscripts, Marx defined progressively the structure of capital as a whole. It therefore represents a turning point, and its relevance needs to be emphasized. Nonetheless, this process did not finish with the Grundrisse. Relevant parts of the theory were changed or improved, both in the manuscripts of 1861 to 1863, in particular with reference to the concepts of market value and production prices, and in the manuscripts of 1863 to 1865, where we have the only extensive exposition of credit and fictitious capital. So you can see that something is happening here, right? Moreover, a proper terminological and conceptual distinction between value, use value, and value form as part of the theory of the commodity, the economic self-form, right, the one from volume 1, was worked out only in the second German edition of Capital, volume 1, in 1872 to 1873, even if this had been latently considered since the manuscripts of 1857 to 1858. Now, you can see sort of that's one among many reasons why the second German edition of Capital, volume 1, is the one chosen for the new translation done by the Pauls, Princeton. Anyway, the 2024 new translation. However, despite Marx's efforts, his theory as a whole remained an unfinished business, in particular the parts for volumes, Capital volumes 2 and 3. Philologists have shown that Engels' editing was at most a good attempt to conclude Marx's drafts. According to the author, those could not absolutely be published because they needed to be developed. Thanks to the new critical edition, we know that one can make sense of Marx's theory of capital only if this mass of unfinished material as a whole is taken into account, with a particular focus on the different phases of its development. So, in the traditional debate, some scholars have pointed out that the Grundrisse should have a predominant position in the interpretation of Marx's thought, because there he made some theoretical points that later were dropped. Now, this is a big point, right? Let me break here for a second. This is the big deal, right? You go look through and go, oh, well, okay, well, this was left out, the fragment of the machines, blah, 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 blah. But actually, all of that is important. In Germany, the so-called Neue Lektur, and in particular authors such as Backhaus and Reichelt, claimed that one can find a proper dialectical exposition of categories only in that text, that is the Grundrisse, while the logical consistency was weakened in subsequent writings. So there is some, perhaps an essentialist reason or originary reason. For other reasons and with other goals, the workerist view shared the idea that the Grundrisse contains more than capital, especially with reference to class struggle and antagonist subjects. Now, that may be, sort of self-fulfilling in some ways. So anyway, back to the author. In this chapter, I shall try to show how Roberto will try to show how Marx successfully improved his theory after the Grundrisse exactly in order to overcome some difficulties that arose from the insufficient dialectical development of categories in the manuscripts of 1857 to 1858, the Grundrisse. This mainly regards the German debate, with which I am sympathetic in spite of some disagreements, but I think that for some implications, the workerist positions are affected as well. In my view, these are wrong regarding some basic definitions. So, there continue to be interpretive issues. And I won't read the notes, although there's a huge note that probably we should read. Let me just go back here to footnote 3. Mode of research, the Forschungsweise, and mode of exposition, the Darstellungsweise, are the expressions used by Marx to define his own method in the afterword to the second German edition of Capital, Volume 1. In Folks's translation, method of inquiry and method of presentation. The category exposition or presentation is a crucial one. In fact, the German term Darstellen does not simply regard the way given results are presented, but the way the theory itself develops through its different levels of abstraction toward totality. Same totality as yesterday, right? It is, in fact, explicit that Marx is referring to Hegel's Darstellung when he uses this word. The process of exposition posits results. Okay, so that's footnote 3. I'm not going to read all the footnotes, but there's one coming up that may need our attention. The aforementioned Neulektür have dealt mainly with the value form, Heinrich et al., and considered the alleged reduction of dialectics with reference to this point. East German scholars in charge of the new critical edition disagreed with them and maintained that only in the second German edition of Capital did Marx consistently define the difference between value and value form, thus completing the value form development. Though I agree, this is Roberto, although I agree that the final version presents problems regarding the relationship of the logical and the historical, the evidence shown by the philologists demonstrate, in my view, a real improvement in Capital. I shall not go into detail into this debate here. However, I would like to point out that from a methodological point of view, it seems to me not to be possible to limit the analysis of the reduction of dialectic only to the value form. We have to take into account also the concept of capital in general. Capital in general. Recall that we've looked at this capital in general before. This is the universality question. And its relationship with other parts of the theory, which in the Grundrisse were set aside. In the English-speaking world, Rothalski's famous inquiry into capital in general was generally accepted as the last word on this issue. In his view, capital in general was only a sort of methodological ladder that was useful while setting up the general framework to shed light on the central role of industrial capital. It could, however, be dropped when the real exposition moved forward to more concrete levels, such as competition and credit. These were included in the theory to avoid a double exposition of an essential part and its repetition in the inessential one. Therefore, capital in general would not be included in the final plan. Note, of course, that there are multiple plans, and as you'll see in the appendix at the end of the article, and it makes our efforts of interpretation more complicated on the one hand. On the other hand, you can sort of see, and that's sort of the beauty of it, as it were, of what Marx was sort of thinking about, and in particular in this idea that or what's useful is, of course, from the Engels point of view and underlying the whole business, you can sort of see the logic at work. This position, back to the text, this position was contested in the German debate, especially in two important studies by Muller and Schwarz. Even if their conclusions are different in relevant points, they share the idea that capital in general was not abandoned at all, but was simply redefined because its relation with competition and other more concrete parts of the theory changed. Even though a few concrete categories were included within the framework of generality, this does not imply that the concept of generality as such was abandoned. Now, we need to understand why a few parts were included and how this can be justified. I cannot go into their analysis here. Rather, this chapter is an attempt to answer those questions in a different way. My starting point is Schwarz's conclusion. Capital in general still works after the manuscripts of 1861 to 1863, although it is almost never explicitly mentioned, and we have to explain why and how, especially accumulation was included within the framework of generality. That was sort of the point of the little chart I showed at the beginning. Okay, back to Roberto's stuff. A preliminary remark. The starting point of this debate was implicitly or explicitly the question, what kind of relation exists between capital in general and competition? Note that this is important, was important in, the explication of what Anwar Sheikh was talking about. I think this is misleading. That is, Roberto thinks this is misleading because there are not, in fact, only two levels of abstraction. According to the most elaborated plans Marx made in the 1850s, particularly in appendices Plan C, Plan E, and Plan F, the concept of capital is divided into four levels of abstraction. A sort of level 0 or simple circulation, a first level called generality, a second one called particularity, and a final one called singularity. So here we have the UPI and a level 0 or simple circulation. So there's four, right? Presenting this sketch, Marx was clearly referring to the division of the Hegelian doctrine of concept. In order to deal with the issue of the overall consistency of this division and the particular problems linked to capital in general, we have to reconstruct how all of these categories were defined at the beginning and how their framework changed while the theory was worked out through its various drafts. No, I won't read the note. You can look at it yourself, but it does show the Hegelian stuff there. And we may get back to it at some point. Fineschi goes through the differences between the French and German editions of Capital, et cetera, et cetera. Drafts. We have to reconstruct how all these categories were defined at the beginning, and how their framework changed while the theory was worked out through its various drafts. The book on capital was supposed to be only the first book in a plan of 6. Remember, the 6-book plan originally defined, and it's laid out in the appendix at the end. In a letter to LaSalle, where Plan D, where he presented this plan for 6 books, he wrote that book 1 on capital had some Vorchapters or preliminary chapters. In another letter to LaSalle, Plan E, he made explicit that these Vorchapters were value and money, presuppositions to capital in general, which is still determined, as we saw in the preceding plan. So, before the exposition of capital, there should be a sort of preliminary frame, the simple circulation that will be called a presupposition that presupposes. In a letter to Engels, Plan F, Marx wrote about the further division of the book on capital, and although he did not use the words particularity and singularity, he mentioned exactly the subjects that should be treated in these sections, respectively, competition and credit/share capital. The same structure, although within a certain general outline, can also be found in the 3 volumes of Capital. So, the final version or the final 3 volumes, or the Engels version, has that structure, kind of. All right, section 1. Generality and particularity of capital. Capital in general should be the first part of the first book. However, with the development of the theory, the plan underwent significant, although not radical, changes. Capital in general should, in fact, have been the title of the continuation of a contribution to the critique of political economy. But while writing this part, that is, the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, which originally bore that title, this category progressively disappeared, and from that moment on was only sporadically mentioned. When he dealt for the first time with the general concept of capital, Marx characterized it as what every capital has in common, the quintessence of it. There are neither capitals nor one capital, but the concept of that which is so far not determined as plurality or unity. The questions of capitals, of plurality arises when the self-development of the theory posits the passage to particularity. The other point strictly connected with the many capitals is competition. This is the outline in the Grundrisse. Quote, or in the most developed plan of the Grundrisse, Plan C, competition, the particularity of capital, is placed in the same framework as accumulation. In the book Capital, on the other hand, competition as such is not in the same framework of accumulation, sort of the crux of the business here in trying to get to 4 levels, right? In the outline of 1857 to 1858, accumulation occurs not only after the circulation of capital, but even after the transformation of capital into capital and profit. In the book Capital, in the text Capital, it is before both the circulation and the transformation of capital into capital and profit. In the outline of 1857 to 1858, both competition and accumulation occur not only after the transformation of capital into capital and profit, but even after the transformation of capital into capital and interest. In the book, in the text Capital, competition is between profit and interest. You can see what's going on here, I hope. These are the changes that need to be explained. Trying to follow Hegel's division of the concept, the exposition begins with the most general categories, the quintessence of capital. At a certain point of development, however, capital's multiplication into many particular capitals is implied. In each of those, generality is incarnated. Once capital is posited, it distinguishes itself from itself and thus is multiplied into many capitals. Quote, the third form of money as independent value in a negative relation vis-a-vis circulation is capital which does not step out of the production process into exchange again to become money. Rather, it is capital which becomes a commodity and enters into circulation in the form of value that refers to itself. So capital and interest. This form presupposes capital in the earlier forms, and at the same time forms the transition from capital to the particular capitals, the real capitals. Since now, in this last form, capital already in its concept divides into 2 capitals with independent existence. Along with the duality, plurality in general is then given. So you can see sort of his brain working here about how this idea of circulation begins. It's sort of implicit in there. Not so much that, well, anyway, thus far, accumulation is not required for capital to be posited. According to this plan, also reproduction will come later. Interest, on the other hand, can already be introduced. Moreover, interest represents the link to proceed from capital to capitals, and many capitals in competition seem to be the same. Therefore, generality coincides with capital before the plurality is posited, and plurality seems to coincide with competition. Accumulation is not required to move to posited capital. So you can see there are different levels of development. Back to the text. Can such a structure be consistent? That is, can capital be posited without or before accumulation? And can we have interest before competition? Accumulation seems to be the decisive passage to move to posited capital. So it is the change of its position in the theory that determines the redefinition of the relationship of generality and particularity. Remember, UPI. I will now attempt, that is Roberto, I will now attempt to demonstrate how and why accumulation became part of generality. Already in the index of 1861, Plan H, in Chapter 4 of Capital in General, we find the title Primitive Accumulation divided into further chapters. The idea of dedicating a chapter to accumulation before the positing of capital is here clearly expressed. Remember that primitive accumulation, the synonym is original accumulation, right? Remember in the translation stuff we've been looking at. Clearly expressed, even though still in a hybrid form where there is no definitive distinction between primitive accumulation and properly capitalistic accumulation. A first, not planned exposition of accumulation is, however, already in the Grundrisse just after the category of relative surplus value. Marx goes into the effects of the reinvestment of the surplus value produced in the previous process of production. We have a second, unplanned occurrence in circulation where he distinguished between primitive accumulation and the properly capitalistic one, and between plucapital 1 and plucapital 2. This was preceded by a first draft of the law of population. Now, we are evidently dealing with categories that in the book Capital, the volume Capital, will be part of the theory of accumulation. According to the plan he was following at the moment anyway, these should have been considered later, but evidently it was the dialectical exposition of the thing itself that took them to their proper place. This new framework for accumulation, which was first attempted in the Grundrisse, was taken up again in the final part of the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, where, at the same time, issues such as accumulation, general reproduction, the relation between one and many capitals, and their levels of abstraction arise clearly. In Capital, accumulation is in volume 1. That Capital, the text, accumulation is in volume 1. General reproduction as a form of extended social accumulation is in volume 2. Circulation of capital is between them. And the whole is before the capital-profit relation, which is within generality. Now, the reason why accumulation is a prerequisite of posited capital is explained by Marx in Capital, Volume 1, Capital, the book, Volume 1. If capital has to be a self-developing process, it needs to produce its presuppositions as a result. In order to do that, it incorporates living labor to get surplus value. It exists inasmuch as it repeats again and again this process, re-implying what it had produced in the same actual process. So reproduction, which takes place in the form of accumulation in the capitalist mode of production, is part of the essence of the concept of capital. The single process of production is an essential link in a chain that presupposes and at the same time is the presupposition of the reproduction of itself and others. Now, essential could be, we can use other ideas without getting into a trap there. The sentence of itself and of others introduces the question of plurality inside accumulation, but it is the exposition itself that takes us there. In Capital, the text, in fact, we find plurality of capitals before profit and before circulation. This means that not only accumulation, but also the many capitals appear before capital is posited. Let us try to understand why this is logically required. Now, let me break here for a second and posit that, if you look at kind of the historical elements, in the pre-modern, pre-capitalist sort of stuff, this is one of the issues that currency exchange has within the context of the Mediterranean world, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you can see some, this is back to my little theory of the Italian banks again. Anyway, it is logically required, first, because the commodity is the economic cell of the capitalist mode of production, the form assumed by products in it. Commodity production presupposes independent and individual producers. A plurality of actors is thus already at stake from the very beginning. That is this level 0, the fourth level. Even if we assume that originally these are not capitalists, they will become capitalists because, in lowercase 1, money is adequately posited only if transformed into capital. Lowercase 2, capital tends to grow and to expand to all branches of production exactly because of its higher productivity. If commodity production is general, then everything is produced as commodity, including means of production and labor power. The production process will be possible, thus, only in capitalist conditions. Those who intend to participate in social reproduction will only be able to do so according to the capitalist rules. This trend of generalization as suggested by Marx himself in the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. Moreover, the necessity of many capitals before profit is thematized explicitly when Marx considers the circulation of capitals as a whole. What we are dealing with in both Part 1 and Part 2 of Volume 2 of Capital, the book, however, was always no more than an individual capital, the movement of an autonomous part of the social capital. However, the circuits of individual capitals are interlinked. They presuppose one another, and it is precisely by being interlinked in this way that they constitute the movement of the social capital. Just as a single commodity turned out to be nothing but one term in the series of metamorphoses of the commodity world as a whole, now individual capital appears as one term in the series of metamorphoses of social capital. It is logically required because, second, the fact that the whole production takes place under capitalist conditions does not mean that it is realized by a single capital. On the contrary, that is exactly what is impossible. You cannot have a single capital, right? You have to have multiple capitals. We know, in fact, that each producer will become a capitalist in the long run, not that there will be only one capitalist, because production is still commodity production. We still have the commodity money relation exchange and so on. The impossibility of a universal capital is clearly stated by Marx in the Grundrisse. Quote, since value forms the foundation of capital, and since it is therefore necessarily exists only through exchange for counter value, it thus necessarily repels itself from itself. A universal capital, one without alien capitals confronting it, with which it exchanges, and from the present standpoint, is therefore a non-thing, a non-thing. The reciprocal repulsion within capitals is already contained in capital as realized exchange value. Close quote. It is logically required because, finally, a plurality of actors were present from the very beginnings, because this is a presupposition implicit in the notion of commodity. Thanks to capital, we have instead an inner trend that changes each single producer into a capitalist. This is why we need accumulation in order to deposit capital. Moreover, in order to have accumulation in a proper way, there also needs to be a first analysis of the relationship among capitals, that is the plural, and their accumulation, so going through a circulation as well. The whole process of the accumulation of the many capitals, that is social general reproduction, must be included in its general concept before particularity and competition. The social general reproduction is the last link before particularity. Marx became aware of the preliminary character of the social general reproduction, that is, accumulation through many capitals, in the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. There he wrote the following. Furthermore, it's necessary to expose the circulation or reproduction process before dealing with deposited capital, that is, capital and profit, since we have to explain not only how capital produces, but also how capital is produced. But the actual movement comes out from the available capital, i.e., on the basis of the developed capitalistic production starting from itself and presupposing itself. I, that is Roberto, call accumulation 1 the process of a single capital reproducing itself. It turns out that from the beginning, the reproduction of this single capital sets up a relationship with others. We have seen that in the end, these others can be only capitals. Each one is a link in a chain, and to deposit properly the accumulation of a single one, we have to consider the condition of the accumulation of each of them in their reciprocal relation. What are the abstract conditions that allow a society of many single capitals to survive as a whole? The answer to this question is the general social reproduction that I call accumulation 2. This is not unlike talking about differential rents 1 and 2, but anyway, back to the text. The main difference from the first plan is that although we have many capitals, We do not yet have particularity or competition. In fact, we've not yet inquired into the trend of each capital acting as such, trying to oust other capitals. On the contrary, Marx's question is, what are the material conditions which appear as value that might allow this kind of society to survive and to grow? We are at the point of view of the totality of capital, not yet at the point of view of the particular capital. Remember what Harvey was talking about in totality yesterday. Now, if we can preliminarily take into account the accumulation of a single capital to show its general laws, we cannot, however, properly reach profit yet, because the single accumulation needs the accumulation of the society as a whole. The core of the distinction in the Grundrisse between generality and particularity, that is, the passage from capital as a whole to particular capitals, turns out to be unacceptable. Many capitals are already necessary in the generality, although this does not mean competition. On the contrary, in the Grundrisse, many capitals and competition were in the same framework. Now, let me break here for a second. You could posit this, and particularly in the pre-modern or pre-capitalist sense, or the late feudal sense, if you want to get into craziness. What then is the main difference between generality and particularity after this change? In generality, we have first a general attitude to the whole, and second, the coincidence of production and consumption, departments 1 and 2. Marx wants first to study how categories work in pure conditions, that is, setting aside the troubling effects of competition and realization problems. These are not marginal, of course, but their decisive role will be considered later in particularity. Now, let me break here a second also to note, yes, this is a micro problem, perhaps, or a statics problem, but let's not go there yet. This condition is still valid in the Capital volumes 1 and 2, and for the first section of volume 3. While dealing with accumulation, Marx claims that there are, at that level, 2 clauses of abstraction. Number 1, the first clause of abstraction, all produced commodities are sold, and all means of production can be purchased without problems on the market. That is, you have one moment. That is, circulation and realization difficulties are, for the moment, left out of consideration. The second clause of abstraction, it is presupposed that surplus value is not divided into specific and more concrete forms such as profit or interest or rent. It is presupposed that surplus value is not divided into specific and more concrete forms such as profit or interest or rent, which belong to a more determined and advanced level. These 2 clauses were already valid in simple circulation and are also still valid in circulation of capital. Note that circulation of capital has always been considered part of generality since the very beginning. This is also valid for social reproduction at the end of volume 2, where Marx explicitly states that even if we have many capitals and their material replacement and reproduction, this does not imply that they are particular. They are not taken into account as many self-valorizing particular capitals, but inasmuch as they act as molecular parts of the whole. Therefore, we can have a first study of the many capitals within generality. The framework of the Grundrisse was dropped because the dialectic of the thing itself implied a more consistent development, which is outlined in the new structure. So you can see there's evolution going on. However, other limits of the original structure need to be overcome. There's a very long set of footnotes here, and you probably go back to that. Now, back to our original scheme of the changes to Marx's concept of capital in general between 1857 and 1863 to 1865. We recall that this is the business between the original plan and the final plan is the movement of one many capitals accumulation is moved into generality as opposed to particularity. And which is, there are a lot of things that change, and this is just one of many little different accumulations or syntheses, and not unlike the machines chapter. Section 2, particularity. The main achievements due to the process of accumulation are, number one, what was presupposed, that is the capital-labor relation, that is the material preconditions of production and so on, has now been posited by capital itself. Now, capital can be a process. Number two, we have the total social reproduction as a whole with the many capitals not yet free to act. Marx needs now to put together these two dimensions of his theory. The whole should include the dynamics of the particular capitals aiming at valorization. Therefore, capital can no longer be considered as ideal average and must become a result of their real dynamics in order to be properly posited and proceed to another more concrete level of abstraction. The produced surplus value is a result of the whole process of capitalist production, that is, production plus circulation, departments 1 and 2. And this process is a self-developing one. The fruit of its work, surplus value, appears as the result of the whole. And so, at the surface, it seems that its rate has to be calculated with reference to all of the anticipated capital, not only to the variable part. Thus, we have profit and rate of profit. In the original plan, this was the final step of generality that then, thanks to the further point, interest, moved to particularity. So after the changes, Marx does not consider interest yet, but capital's particular interaction, the forms of their reciprocal fight for self-valorization, that is, for profit. Each one realizes its general laws yielding profit as a particular agent among various other particular ones. So far, we've already looked at these already existent various capitals as necessary, but they are regarded as subordinated moments of capital's dynamics as a whole. Now we go further and consider their particular action as real actualizers of generality. At this point, Marx drops one of the crucial clauses of abstraction of generality, that is, supply no longer equals demand. In particularity, Marx inquires into the interaction of capitals when these are free to move in conformity, but not with an average established from outside as hypothesis, but with their real movement, that is, competition. Marx considers two kinds of competition. The first is inside a branch and produces a market value for all products realized and sold in that branch. This is already a social value that does not correspond to individual ones. Only the commodities produced by the capitals, which apply the average technical conditions, have an individual value magnitude that corresponds to the social one. The second kind of competition is among different branches and produces the price of production. This is the average of the average, that is, a particular market price whose profit is at the same time socially average. Marx achieved this result for the first time in the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. The argument is taken up again in the manuscripts of 1863 to 65, while exposing the rules of competition that give production prices as a result. And finally, thanks to Engels in Capital Volume 3. See, for instance, the following passages. Quote, what competition brings about, first of all, in one sphere, is the establishment of a uniform market value and market price out of the various individual values of commodities. But it is only the competition of capitals in different spheres that brings forth the production prices that equalizes the rate of profit between those spheres. It has been said that competition equalizes profit rates between the individual spheres of production to produce an average rate of profit, and that this is precisely the way in which the values of products from these various spheres are transformed into prices of production. This uninterrupted emigration and immigration of capitals that takes place between various spheres of production produces rising and falling movements in the profit rate, which more or less balance one another out and thus tend to reduce the profit rate everywhere to the same common and general level, unquote. Now, a general rate of profit, this is back to Fineschi, a general rate of profit for the entire society is no longer an abstract concept, but the result of real dynamics of particular capitals. A particular case incarnates the general average. This social average is obviously not unchangeable once fixed. It changes following exactly the two trends of competition towards new quote-unquote standards. The crucial achievement we were interested in, however, is that the presupposed social average is now a result of the real process of competing capitals. The abstract magnitudes that refer to the whole are now a concrete profit gained by a particular branch of production. An average that will obviously change, but which will be replaced by another average. Particular and general are actual in a single moment. This result is the link to proceed towards singularity. We will see that interest-bearing capital is very important to achieve this, but interest is another category that changes its position from the manuscripts of 1857 to 58 to those of 1863 to 65. Section 3, towards singularity. In the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, after an analysis of the tendency of the profit rate to fall, Marx deals with the first time with a few questions linked to the further development of the theory, which previously it had only been sporadically indicated. We need to understand if these categories correspond to the concept of singularity sketched out in 1857 to 58. In the cited letter to Engels, see Plan F, he spoke about the division of the book and of capital into 4 points. In the Grundrisse draft, particularly, competition was followed by singularity, which was further divided into 3 points. See Plan C, that is credit, share capital, and money market. The reconstruction of the inner logic of this part and its connection with the preceding one are made more difficult by the increasing reduction of the dialectical terminology. Now, we find here a further difference with reference to the Grundrisse. The logic of the argument shows that interest-bearing capital is required to proceed to singularity. In the manuscripts of 1857 to 8, it was a step between generality, which ended with the capital-profit relation, and particularity. We have seen above how Marx defined it. The end of generality was the capital-profit relation, M-M prime. Yes, finally. That is an increased quantity of money compared with the anticipated capital. The dynamics that produced it disappears in the result. We have more money as a sort of fact. The thing money seems to be able to generate more money, as if this should be a quality of it. Now, this M-M prime, this is the foundation of the category interest-bearing capital and the fetishism of capital, not to be confounded with the fetishism of commodities. So there's a difference here. Remember this. Fetishism of commodities happens at a quote-unquote different level. Anyway, successively, this definition is partially conserved, partially changed. In the manuscripts of 1863 to 65, the same concept is taken up again with these words, quote, with interest-bearing capital, the situation is different. And this is precisely what constitutes its specific character. The owner of money who wants to valorize this as interest-bearing capital parts with it. Someone else puts it into circulation, makes it into commodity as capital not only for himself, but for others. It is not simply capital for the person who alienates it, but is made over to the other person as capital right from the start, as value that possesses the use value of creating surplus value or profit. Close quote. The two expositions could seem similar, but the difference is essential, exactly because of the change in the general framework we previously analyzed. So, as we saw, generality consisted in an ideal average that had to proceed to a real positive average. This occurs thanks to the action of the many capitals in competition that leads to average profit and production prices. In order to posit interest-bearing capital as moment of the real process, the mere generality is then not enough. To have capital perceived as a thing, the actors of the process at the surface of society need to become aware somehow of this average. The existence of an average fruit of capital must be socially perceived as a fact, naturally generated by capital, disregarding the real process that put it into existence. This is possible only after competition has posited the ideal average as a real fact, as average social profit, something given to the social actor at the surface. This seems a fact because it appears as given. Now, since profit yielding appears as a quality of the thing, capital/money, capital can be lent as a sort of commodity. Its use value is profit generation, as though we could set aside the real process of valorization. What was a general achievement in the capital/profit relation now becomes a phenomenal economic category, which really operates at the surface and also in the mind of the actors. The consequences are relevant. Quote, the characteristic movement of capital in general, the return of money to the capitalist, the return of capital to its point of departure, receives, in the case of interest-bearing capital, a completely superficial form separated from the real movement whose form it is. Here, therefore, the return does not appear as a consequence and result of a definite series of economic processes, but rather as a consequence of a special legal contract between buyer and seller. The period of the reflux depends on the course of the reproduction process. In the case of interest-bearing capital, its return as capital seems to depend simply on the contract between lender and borrower. And so the reflux of the capital in connection with this transaction no longer appears as a result determined by the production process, but rather as if the capital lent out had never lost the form of money. Now, of course, their transactions are actually determined by the real refluxes, but this is not apparent in the transaction itself. Close quote. 2 points seem to be decisive. Number one, thanks to capital's relation with itself as mere quantity of money, where its increase in quantity seems to be property of the object capital, the generality of valorization is concretely individualized in interest-bearing capital. Therefore, interest-bearing capital distinguishes itself from all concrete processes of capitalist production, representing tangibly in front of them their ideal dimension. Now, in this way, it empirically exists in front of all the other operating capitals as their essence, and these appear as one particular mode of its incarnation. General capital appears phenomenally in front of particular capitals as their immaterial form of movement, as pure M-M prime. In the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, Marx claims, quote, this is the quite tangible form of self-valorizing value or of money making money, and at the same time, the quite irrational form, the incomprehensible, mystified form. In the discussion of capital, we started from M-C-M prime, of which M-M prime was only a result. We now find M-M prime as the subject, the incomprehensible form we encounter at the surface, and which has therefore constituted the starting point of our analysis, is found again as the result of the process in which the figure of capital is gradually more and more estranged and unrelated to its inner essence. We started with money as the converted form of the commodity. What we arrive at is money as the converted form of capital, just as we've known that the commodity is the precondition and the result of the production process of capital. Close quote. Valorization as intrinsic property of the thing, money, the contradictory riddle that was the starting point of the inquiry into capital, is now a result of the process of capital as a whole. Number two, this is the starting point of the fetishism of capital. Remember, it's not the same as the fetishism of commodities, right? This is the starting point of the fetishism of capital. In simple circulation, the thing money seems to be value in itself. Now it is capital that seems to be a thing that generates interest in itself. We have thus achieved the particular existence of capital in general. Interest-bearing capital appears as capital par excellence. Existing capital as such that stays in front of the real processes of production as if it generated profit by itself without going through them. Interest seems to be what repays its natural lucrativeness, while profit appears to be the result of the real material application of that abstract universality in a particular branch. Several times in this manuscript, Marx focuses on the division of capital into interest-bearing capital as Kapital an sich, that is Hegelian words, and its particular existing forms as operating, working capitals. Quote, interest is definitely posited as the offspring of capital, separate, independent, and outside the capitalist process itself. It is due to capital as capital. I think this is it. It enters into the production process and therefore proceeds from it. Capital is impregnated with interest. It does not derive interest from the production process, but brings it into it. The surplus of profit over interest, the amount of surplus value which capital derives solely from the production process, i.e., the surplus value it produces as operating capital, acquires a particular figure as industrial profit. Employer's profit, industrial or commercial, depending on whether the stress is laid on the production process or the circulation process, Department 1, Department 2. In contrast to interest as value creation due to capital in itself, capital for itself, capital as capital, close quote. Interest is a fruit of capital in itself, profit of capital in process. The abstract separation of real dimension and value dimension in the realization of capital, two dimensions that are immanent to each capital, has now become an actual one. This implies a doubling of the figure of the capitalist on the one hand, the juridical owner of capital, on the other, the real operating capitalist. Quote, there are not two different kinds of capital, interest-bearing and profit-yielding, but the self-same capital which operates in the process of production. As capital produces a profit which is divided between two different capitalists, one standing outside the process, and as owner representing capital as such. But it is an essential condition of this capital that it is represented by a private owner. Without this, it does not become capital as opposed to wage labor, and the other representing operating capital, capital which takes part in the production process. Close quote. Now, let me break here for a second, and yes, you could actually. Testing. Okay. At the end of particularity, we had average profit produced by a particular branch. This is a necessary step to go further. Now that average valorization of capital exists as general, universal form in a particular capital, but representing capital as such in front of all particular capitals. The universality of capital present in each of them is now concretely incarnated in a particular existing capital in front of them. Universal exists as particular and therefore is singular. So complete whatever. This is a further relevant improvement with reference to the outline in the Grundrisse, where profit and interest overlapped in the end. The logic of the thing itself is shown how interest and interest-bearing capital can be posited just after competition and represent a link to singularity. Section 4, singularity. Now we have an existing capital in general. We now need to see how this whole of capital works when we reach this final level of abstraction. This part was developed by Marx almost exclusively in the manuscripts of 1863 to 65, raising an interesting question about the 64 to 67. But anyway, until a few years ago, we could read only Engels' edition of Marx's manuscript of Volume 3. Thanks to the new critical edition of the works of Marx and Engels in the MIGA, the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe. The original manuscript appeared in 1992. This was the occasion for a broad debate, mainly on the transformation problem. That text, however, is also very useful as regards the question of the levels of abstraction, in particular regarding singularity. If we compare Marx's outline of the manuscript with Engels' published version, we see immediately how relevant the differences are. In particular, what was indicated by Marx as the final chapter of the part on capital, credit, and fictitious capital became one chapter among several others, a single point put next to various others, not the title of the whole part. On the contrary, Marx quite clearly intended to work out a whole divided into three chapters that are coherently signed as capital 1, capital 2, and capital 3. Roman numeral 1, let me check that. Into three chapters that are coherently signed as Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, and Roman numeral 3. Moreover, Engels created several chapters, also giving them a title. Some of those were produced out of passages that Marx had eloquently entitled Confusion. This part was a collage of citations that, as such, evidently did not belong to the exposition. Page numbers were also different. Engels transformed these passages into a text by putting together citations and adding a few pages of his own before, after, and in the middle of Marx's quotes. If the real subject of the section became one chapter among several others, all on the same level, and if some of those were even created by Engels himself, going back to Marx's original manuscript, is then evidently crucial. As said, Marx's manuscript seems to be an exposition of a general framework entitled Credit and Fictitious Capital, divided into three steps. First step. First step, a part with an outline of the features of properly capitalist credit commercial. A part with the outline of the features of properly capitalist credit, commercial credit, and bank credit. In Engels' edition, this became chapter 25, with, however, a few modifications. He put many footnotes directly into the text. Number 2, a second part, where Marx sketched the functions of credit in the capitalist mode of production. Here, he concretely dealt for the first time with share capital. In the published book, this is chapter 27. Number 3, the exposition divided into three points of this level of abstraction as a whole. Credit and fictitious capital divided into 3 steps, 1, 2, and 3. The exposition divided into 3 points of this level of abstraction as a whole. In Engels' edition, this is chapters 28 to 32. So, if we compare the structure of the manuscript with the hypothesis of the 4 levels of abstraction, we find interesting evidence. First, we have chapter 5, whose interest-bearing capital represents the link to proceed beyond the exposition of credit and fictitious capital as a whole. Credit, as totality, constitutes then the last step of the exposition of capital as such. Moreover, interest-bearing capital clearly represents the link to it. Second, the central categories of credit and share capital are outlined as the most concrete forms of existence of capital. It could be shown that fictitious capital corresponds to the most developed exposition of share capital. The structure of singularity corresponds to that presented by Marx in the Grundrisse and in the aforementioned letter to Engels. This would confirm that he further elaborated a structure that was already outlined in the Grundrisse. A detailed analysis of this level of abstraction cannot be conducted here. I will limit myself to an outline. Thanks, Roberto. Number one, in the first part of Singularity, Marx shows how the logically developed capitalist mode of production reshapes inherited pre-existing categories, which is here credit from the simple circulation derived from money as a means of payment, positing it in a form adequate to the new level of abstraction. This becomes the new basis of the capitalist credit system. The first new category is that of bank credit. The capitalist division of labor implies that the functions linked to the management of money as such are monopolized by an individual capitalist, that is, the banker. Since money is now an interest-bearing thing, by managing money, the bank has the general formula of capital M-M prime under its control, as if it were a phenomenal object. Thus, the bank is the phenomenal, empirically existing representative of capital as such. Capital in general, which at the beginning was a mere abstraction, exists empirically as a category in interest-bearing capital and operates thanks to the universal capitalist, that is, the bank. The money market is the further development of bank credit. The second step consists in showing, number one, lowercase Roman numeral 1, the genesis of share capital, lowercase Roman numeral 2, its fictitious nature, and then Roman numeral 3, lowercase, the general achievement of this level of abstraction that actually can be clear only in light of the following point. That is the third step 3, the explanation of how capital works as a whole, once it has achieved its most concrete level, that is credit and share capital. Now, this argument is divided into 3 further steps. The most important issue regards the independent but interconnected lives of fictitious and real capital. First, to fix the general nature of monetary flow, Marx shows that capital and circulation are not independent concepts. Disputing the accounts of Tuke and Fullerton, he leads the problem back to the different functions of money, which it can exist both in revenue form and as capital. Second, he shows the conceptual origin of share capital and its natural trend to become fictitious. Thus, the money market is extended to speculation. Each capital has a double nature, material and monetary. The two of them do not exist separately, but interest-bearing capital allows that separation to appear possible. And thus these are split and act, each one on its own, respectively, in the financial market and in material production. The first is, of course, dependent on the second one, but value magnitudes have to correspond only at the end. Insofar as the first undergoes its fictitious experiences, its value can apparently change according to supply and demand. This causes real money transfers. Third, he tries to outline the relationship between fictitious accumulation, which seems to become autonomous, and real accumulation. He starts with lowercase Roman numeral 1, the analysis of commercial credit, setting aside the bank credit, and of commercial and bank credit together, considering the consequence on the rate of interest. He then, lowercase Roman numeral 2, proceeds taking into account the relation between boosted shares and real accumulation of capital. Finally, he considers, lowercase Roman numeral 3, the accomplished unity or reunification of value, apparently independent, thanks to share and fictitious capital. The unity of value and use value, that is the real material process of reproduction, of abstract and concrete form of wealth in capitalist production. The crisis. So we've gotten to the end, and that, there's a lot going on there and probably needs to be outlined further. Conclusion. Ricardo's conclusion. In the manuscripts of 1857 to 58, Marx's plan for the book on capital was divided into three main sections that, following Hegel's articulation of the concept, were called generality, particularity, and singularity. While writing his theory, according to that scheme, a few changes occurred. Some features that should have been part of particularity were included in generality, that is, the relationship between one and many capitals. Some features that should have been the link between generality and particularity became the link between particularity and singularity, namely interest-bearing capital. However, the triad continued to constitute the core of the dialectical exposition of capital as regards the logic of the system, even if those terms were not explicitly mentioned. If at the beginning Marx tried to apply Hegel's scheme to a given matter, he had later understood that the very theory of capital could be worked out only following its own inner dialectical logic. This is why changes occurred in the final structure is more dialectical and consistent than the original one. Now, the consequence is that the Grundrisse were insufficient, first, for the development of the theory as a whole, because particularity and singularity were not yet considered. Second, because even generality needed corrections regarding the level of abstraction of the many capitals. These changes represent improvements because the final outline is more consistent and dialectical than the original one. On the other hand, this does not imply any rupture or radical discontinuity between the first manuscript and the subsequent ones. Rather, Marx further developed a general outline, the structure of generality, particularity, singularity, or UPI, that he had initially sketched out in the Grundrisse. We then have some changes, improvements regarding the general soundness of the theory in the same plan. However, this was not concluded and remained a draft. So, that's the problem, of course, of all. Included in Roberto Fineschi's article are appendices. Plan A, in the introduction to manuscripts of 1857 to 8, and it has these abstract determinations as I mentioned above. Plan B, same set of manuscripts. Plan C, from the same manuscripts. Plan D and E, letters to LaSalle, and Plan F, a letter to Engels. So this article, this chapter, has had all of those elements brought together in, I would assert, a fairly coherent way. Now, the position of creating 4 or 3 things is not a big deal. And in fact, this idea of a fourth is actually interesting, only because it indicates a kind of, and forgive the implication, that is a kind of recursiveness in the structure. So anyway, that's my little conclusion from this. And I think I've run out of time, or I've gone over my time, and I will stop this. What we have been looking at on 27 July is Roberto Fineschi on the 4 levels of abstraction in Marx's concept of capital, or can we consider the Grundrisse as the most advanced version of Marx's theory of capital? It appears in the text, in Marx's Laboratory, Critical Interpretations of the Grundrisse, edited by Riccardo Bellafiore, Guido Starosta, and Peter D. Thomas. So anyway, there it is. I will thank you for your attention.